So with that said, I wanted to go through this great panel that we've put together for you today and just kind of introduce folks really in alphabetical order, moving left to right on your screen, and just go over some quick bios. In the interest of time, I'll just introduce everyone, starting with Mike Baker. Michael Baker is an accomplished cybersecurity executive, passionate about building high-performing teams and transforming the way cyber risk is managed within the business. He brings nearly 20 years of experience in the field across cyber leadership, talent development, risk management, audit, and compliance, serving the aerospace and defense industry as CISO along with a variety of clients across industries as a seasoned consultant. So Michael currently serves, as you can see, as Vice President and CISO for GDIT, serving within the Office of the CIO. And in this role, he manages a team of professionals across all aspects of internal cyber operations, computer network defense, policy, awareness, incident response, threat intelligence, and secure architecture. Prior to this role, Mr. Baker worked at EY Consulting for a wide variety of clients across the defense, retail, banking, and technology sectors, including 11 years for General Dynamics, providing cyber and IT services across all GD business units. Perhaps most important to note is that Michael was a graduate of the highly esteemed James Madison University. Go Dukes. And next to Mike, we've got Mr. Ed Bassett, CISO for NeoSystem. Mr. Bassett is a senior cybersecurity and risk management subject matter expert with over 32 years of experience in all aspects of security and privacy program architecture, design, management, and operations. His experience spans government contractors, government, healthcare, financial services, and other industries, and includes risk management, program planning, application, and software security. He built and led a global security consulting practice prior to joining NeoSystem, specializing in security strategy, assessment and testing, and managed security services. He has been the principal advisor to many Fortune 500 and government clients on information system security, responsible for securing their critical information assets, sensitive health records, and classified military communication. Ed is a U.S. Army veteran and a graduate of Clarkson University, where he earned a degree in computer science. Myself, Neal Beggan, I'm a principal in the Risk and Accounting Advisory Services group of Cherry Bekaert. As part of that, I'm responsible for leading the firm's IT audit group. I'm based here locally in Washington, D.C. and oversee co-sourced internal audit projects for businesses and nonprofit organizations, as well as audit and consulting projects for the public and private sector. In addition to several certifications, I'm one of the first 100 provisional assessors for CMMC in the country, and lead the firm's efforts around our advisory and soon-to-be certification efforts for CMMC. Prior to joining Cherry Bekaert, I worked at a regional accounting firm as an IT audit manager, as an IT audit senior with EY's Technology and Security Risk Services practice, and as a consultant with the Risk Advisory Service practice at KPMG, where I held a top secret clearance. I feel like that's of note with this conversation here today. And certainly last but not least, Jeff Trinidad is the Director for Supply Chain Cybersecurity for L3Harris Technologies. He is responsible for strategy development related to supply chain cyber risk, including policy development and implementation of technology to streamline supplier compliance with cybersecurity laws and regulations. He and his team work with L3Harris employees and suppliers, providing informational resources, training, and assistance in an effort to proactively identify and mitigate risk. When you'll notice Jeff speaking, once the slides are off and you can see Jeff's camera, you will see that he's an avid Cubs fan, not to be confused with the Yankees, with the pinstripes there on his back wall. So thank you again to all the panelists. Just a general note, we set this agenda, I think, well over a month ago, and really at the time, we thought an area of focus for today's session would be on these pilot RFPs and the impacts of CMMC requirements in said RFPs. However, unless anybody on the panel knows differently than I do, as early as this morning, we have not seen any of the pilot RFPs issued with CMMC requirements. So instead, what we want to do is take a couple minutes before jumping into kind of panelist questions to just kind of look at the current state of affairs with CMMC. There is an assumption here that everyone attending today has knowledge overall of CMMC program, as it's been out for well over a year at this point. But certainly if follow-up information is needed or required, every single one of the folks on the panel, not only are we providing our contact information, we have all been a part of numerous webinars, podcasts, and so forth to date that are readily available, and we'd be happy to provide more of that background information. But in terms of timeline, where we are, this program is still, let's be honest, in its infancy, and is being rolled out, and as a result is changing and is in the process of changing, as do many new programs that are being rolled out. But where we kind of are in terms of kind of building this ecosystem of folks that will help is last month they started training provisional instructors for the CMMC program. So really stepping away from the formed CMMC accreditation body, they're looking to employ actual instructors beyond the volunteers that had done it to date. And as a result, they will start providing certified classes later this month and probably into May with what are called licensed training providers. So again, taking that role away from the what was previously being conducted by the accreditation board and getting it out to actual licensed training providers. And then the next round of exams in order for folks to get certified to be able to conduct assessments for certification are scheduled for later this summer. And that's really meant to help populate the supply and demand needed for this what's called provisional period. So as a result of these folks going through these programs already to date, and then with these classes being offered later this month and into the summer, it's going to result in roughly about 110 C3POs, which are the assessment organizations that have been certified as these third parties that will be able to conduct assessments for certification. Important to note that there aren't any to date that can do that. Again, this is as of this morning, although I tried to get on the AB's website right before jumping on this, and it's shut down for the moment, so they may be making updates. But as of this morning, there were no C3POs in the market that could conduct assessments that result in certification. They are forthcoming though. Once the provisional period is ending, really looking forward, this is a 5-year rollout, as many of you have heard. So if you look at 2021 through 2025, you will see an exponential increase in solicitations with the CMMC requirements, growing each year, and then expected that in 2026, every single DoD solicitations will have CMMC requirements. It's also widely expected, and I think most people know at this point, that the intent of CMMC, while it originated with the DoD, it is being looked at and already has been looked at by civilian agencies as well. So it is expected to roll well beyond the DoD. And so you'll start seeing more and more folks come on board, more trainings being offered, and therefore more certifications being issued for folks that are able to meet the demand over this period. This is the most recent, what's called the Notional CMMC pilot timeline, which is provided by the DoD that is for public distribution here, and you can kind of follow along. They started updating this back in January, but you can kind of see where we are. Even in April, you can kind of see that Notional was that they were going to issue RFPs. We're sitting here on today, I believe the 13th. Have not seen them yet, but still have a couple more weeks to go in case they wanted to meet this April timeline for issuing the initial pilot RFPs that will have a CMMC requirement. And at that point, obviously, they're suggesting that you're reaching out to authorize and approve C3POs, which are coming on board to schedule your assessments. And if you fast forward to kind of submitting a proposal in the June-July timeframe with award being in August, the important thing to remember as a result of CMMC, you do not have to be certified in order to respond to an RFP, but you do have to have an actual certification in order to be awarded a contract. And the last update I wanted to give was just kind of current status of providers. There's a lot of concern, and rightfully so, on, as I mentioned, kind of the supply and demand and potential for log jams. And there are several credentials here from an individual perspective, but as well as an organizational perspective. Probably the two most important to note are the RPOs, not a requirement, but RPOs are really designed as registered practitioner organizations that are intended to help government contractors prepare for CMMC compliance. You can see here where we are at the end of March. We've got about 484 of those that are out in the marketplace. versus C3POs, which at the end of last month, there were a little over 100 approved. I think this morning there was 113 on the website. And again, these are the folks that ultimately will be able to conduct assessments for certifications, but there aren't any now that have been approved. The reason being, every single C3PAO has to get their own CMMC level 3 certifications themselves, which is actually being conducted by the DoD's audit arm, DCMA's DIBCAC reviews, in order for them to become a final C3PO that then can in turn go out into the market. So again, just from a current status, I kind of want to start with that. And really, I'm going to leave this slide up for a little bit and maybe come back to it. I'm going to stop sharing. Actually, we'll come back to this with contact information just so that folks have it. But kind of jumping into it and staying with kind of several recent items of note. Jeff, I wanted to start with you, if that's okay. The CMMC final rule is still pending. However, last week, Katie Arrington from the DoD did mention that this final rule is expected to be issued within the next 30 to 40 days. So we're expecting that next month. So Jeff, my question would be, what are some of the anticipated changes you're expecting and or hoping to see when this rule does go final?
Yeah, thanks. I don't anticipate major changes. I know there was a lot of feedback that was provided from industry. So you may see some, clarification or questions answered, but if you're one of those suppliers that's expecting major changes, I wouldn't anticipate that. Really what I hope is that there is a focus on DFAR 7020 and the NIST 800-171 compliance, because as CMMC rolls out over the next 5 years, that's really where the major focus is going to be. And then the other area that I really hope that they address is the reciprocity. I know in the government and especially in industry, that's always been a big challenge. So hopefully they're able to really define that to make it easier for vendors and DoD suppliers to get their certifications, update their reps and certs, and alleviate having to report it multiple times to multiple customers.
Yeah, couldn't agree with that more. Truthfully, I was on 2 calls this morning with folks talking about readiness. Both actually had their ISO 27001 cert already. One was in a position where it made sense to wait and see about the final rule because they're not in a hurry, whereas the other one is a little bit more difficult decision to make because they are proactively looking to get certified as quickly as possible, looking at the pilot program. So when we are speaking with clients and prospects, it tends to run the gamut, but certainly reciprocity is a huge thing that's kind of still hanging out there that everybody's waiting with bated breath.
I think that's a big deal, right, Neal?
Because from your side, yep.
Sorry, it's a huge deal because companies have made a lot of investments already. As you mentioned, your clients ISO 27001 certified, and there have been public statements that have said, we will not be duplicating any effort that has already taken place. Right. So I think to Jeff's point, outside of changes to the model itself, particularly in the higher levels, like from a GDIT perspective, and I'm sure an L3Harris perspective, is that's the #1 thing we're waiting for, because we've invested in DIBCAC assessments. We've been audited a number of times. And I think as long as they're within kind of the scope of the period that they're concerned about, I definitely look forward to seeing some reciprocity implemented here. To go along with the statements that have been made now for 6 months, right, from DoD itself, saying that nothing's going to be duplicated.
Yep. No, that's a good point. Mike, Ed, did you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I think, there's 2 pieces of that interim rule, right? There's a piece around the SPURS reporting or NIST 800-171 compliance, which is really intended just to sort of add some enforcement to what was already required in the DFAR 7012. That some people viewed it as an interim measure that kind of carries us until full implementation of CMMC. I would not expect any changes there that are going to make that go away. So yeah, I guess I agree with the other 2 panelists. I think maybe some clarification there. There's been some confusion over how that applies to people who don't have any CUI, who don't have any covered contractor information systems. So that's an area that's been a little confusing. I think it's maybe a matter of interpretation of what exactly you're supposed to do if you have the DFAR 7012 and 7019 clauses in your contract, but you don't have any covered contractor information systems. do you have to report a score? If so, what are you scoring if you have no systems? There's been some confusion on things like that I hope will get clarified. But I think in terms of people thinking maybe that requirement will be extended, that's enforcement of an existing requirement that's been in place since 2017. So I would say certainly not going to get pushed out any further.
Yeah, great point, Ed. Mike, if only there was some sort of, I don't know, maybe an industry advisory council, right? Provide some of this feedback. I say that in jest because, again, with recent items of notes, is this formation by the AB of this industry advisory council. We're lucky enough to have Mike Baker here with us today, who is named to that committee, which is a fantastic group of folks. So Mike, can you explain the role of the IAC and really why you wanted to get involved?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very exciting, right? If you look back on the CMMC AB, Jeff had just talked about the formal feedback to the rules that are going to be coming down from a contracts perspective, which is obviously of pivotal importance as it relates to DoD. But you look at the other side of the coin, which is the CMMC AB, which regardless of what you read, has been an accumulation of volunteers over the last year that have done amazing work to try to implement this mission in some way, shape, or form. If you go down the rabbit hole of like social media and LinkedIn and some news articles, you may lose sight of that. It's definitely been a bumpy road. There's no doubt about that. One of the main points of feedback they've received is that there's just not enough representation from industry, both large primes, smaller companies, smaller DIB members, other subcontractors and things like that on major programs, of which there's no channel to give that feedback. So like, for instance, one major question that we didn't mention was like the true cost of implementation of CMMC. Well, like we think about that question, you're going to get, if you have 10 people in a room or 10 companies, you're going to get 10 different answers, right? There's been some things out there that are probably flat wrong, right? So I applaud the CMMC AB for putting the call out there for volunteers to serve on the Industry Advisory Council, mainly to get, again, the voice of the end user of the company here, to get some real world experience and application and some feedback going as it relates to the model that they're pushing along. So I'm very, very excited to join it. Why I personally want to get involved was, again, as a GDIT is a large prime contractor here in the DIB space. We take CMMC extremely seriously, and we're behind it from a mission perspective. But as you move past the mission and the end goal, there are some real hiccups in implementation that we need to work out, right? So that we can preserve the integrity of the defense industrial base, particularly our small business community, while still, pushing the mission of protecting the nation's, sensitive data, right? So for me, it was a no-brainer to get involved and provide that feedback and be the voice of a larger prime. That said, I encourage, we gave all of our contact information. My thing is I'm going to be having conversations not only within my company, but also within our supply community to make sure I get all that feedback. And I encourage anyone on this call that wants to have a conversation to please reach out as well. And we're going to start meeting very, very soon. And I'm hoping we'll have a positive influence on the way the CMMC AB begins to implement this model. I think it's very, very exciting and a step in the right direction.
Very generous of you, and would highly recommend that folks take him up on that offer. Let's just stay with the AB for a second. Obviously, it was primarily volunteer run for a while, and as Mike said, what they've been able to accomplish has been nothing short of a miracle. And it's certainly at this point taking shape as an actual organization. They've recently hired a new CEO and have started actually hiring employees, paid employees, in this goal of setting up a 501c3 organization. So Ed, with this formalization, this reaching out to industry, setting up the IAC with actually hiring of C-suite and other staff, what do you think this signals in terms of the role of the AB going forward?
Well, I think, yeah, I'll echo both Mike's and your comments that what they've done with volunteers in the first year or so of their existence has been pretty amazing. I think as we look to its evolution, we got to sort of think about what is the role of the AB, right? So CMMC is not their initiative; it's a Department of Defense initiative, it's a government initiative. So the CMMC AB has been set up outside of the government as a nonprofit to for the main purpose of building out an assessment process and ecosystem that can be a level playing field for making sure that certifications are done fairly and equally across a lot of organizations. So they've got a pretty tight focus there. I think sometimes people try to tack on other missions to them. What I see happening so far, just as they're starting to add staff in the discussions that they've been having, is really focusing on scale, right? So putting training out there, getting the ecosystem built up. So you had some statistics on the earlier slide where you showed kind of the number of people that have signed up for some of their badges. But key among that is getting the training out to people who can train at scale. So educational organizations, training companies, educational institutions, people that can get assessors trained quickly and in large enough numbers to make the DoD's 5-year rollout possible. And make sure that's level in a way, right? That's so that an assessment that's done by one C3PAO is effectively the same as if it's done by another C3PAO. So making sure that there's a good sense of fairness there. I think people look at that maybe as they will be a sort of a Q&A or help desk place to go to get answers to all your CMMC questions. I don't think that's an appropriate role, and I don't know that they're going to go there. Although, like many, I have sent them a number of questions to see what kind of response I get. So it's a place to go to look for that information, but I don't think that's a formalized role. I really like the industry advisory council angle, Mike, that that you're on. That's a spectacular item there. I think the next big hurdle beyond sort of scale and pure volume is going to be dealing with the real world considerations, right? As CMMC starts to smash into the reality of how systems are actually built and managed, and we start to sort that out, there's going to be some case law that comes out of that. And I hope that the CMMC AB can play a role in that, in the sense of putting out some, case law clarifications, things about how those situations should be resolved so that they're not being resolved differently by different assessors. So that I think is probably, again, next after the scale problem, which is their immediate challenge.
Yeah, I would agree. And you talk about real world, and one that you couldn't get away from the last couple of months is obviously the SolarWinds breach and the impact that it had, but also the change in administration, which oftentimes can lead to different policy and so forth. However, obviously, with the Biden administration's announcement within the last week of the investment into and continued increase into the investment of cybersecurity, Ed, just staying with you, kind of safe to say the need for implementing more robust cyber programs, not something that's going away anytime soon, correct?
Not going away. I mean, from a political perspective, I think it's not a partisan thing to think about whether cybersecurity is important. SolarWinds breach, some of the exploitation of Microsoft Exchange that we saw after that. This is the capability of our adversaries on display, right? So people say wake up call, and some people say we've had enough wake up calls, we're already awake. But this is our adversaries doing things on a grand scale. There was a Microsoft estimate that said that they believed there were 1,000 people on the SolarWinds attack team. So our adversaries amassed 1,000 people to put this plan and execute that attack, and it was spectacularly successful. So these are the kind of things that make us realize, yes, it's going to take a concerted effort. It's not going to be one thing, one law, one government policy or something that's going to solve this. It's going to be countrywide, right? All country response to these kind of things. One of the things that I noted in listening to SolarWinds did a interview talking about some of the ways they had responded. They said, hey, we got nailed by this massive attack. We've done a lot of things in response to that to make sure it doesn't happen again. And you should ask all your software vendors to do those things. In other words, they're doing them because they were victimized and are now responding, but recognizing that was not the standard of care in the industry, still not the standard of care beyond them and a few people in their orbit. So they're saying, hey, please ask all your software vendors to take these actions. But this is I think, a whole country response that we're seeing moving in many parts. And are they going to continue? Are they going to accelerate? Yes, I think both those questions.
I'd agree. And staying with that, Jeff, in terms of SolarWinds, how did that affect your own third-party risk management and or interactions with your subs from an L3 Harris perspective?
Yeah, just to add to Ed's point, I think, the programs are going to evolve because our adversaries are going to evolve. Once we think we have SolarWinds solved, there's going to be another type of attack. I'm sure hackers are already out there planning their next, attack on our vulnerability. So it's not going to stop. So you kind of have to accept that fact, and you really prioritize your efforts. So some of the things that we're looking at is to be a little bit more proactive in identifying, potential attacks from our suppliers, using third-party vendors that can do some open source intelligence gathering and give us indicators that, potentially a supplier has been, a victim of a cyber attack. With that comes the challenges. The two major challenges that we have are, one, suppliers don't know that they're victims, but two, even if they are, if it doesn't include L3 Harris, data, what's the contractual obligation to report that incident? And I think that was another takeaway from SolarWinds. So those are two challenges. So you kind of got to go back to the basics, engaging your suppliers, educating them. We're doing town halls at the segment level to educate on what SolarWinds did, how they may be impacted, and kind of remediation steps. We're doing surveys through our supplier vetting tools to say, hey, if you think you've been impacted, let us know. So that way we can kind of gain a grasp on the situation. But it really comes down to that engagement and reaching out. And then the third thing that we're doing is we're really working with industry partners in the ISAC to really look at our cyber incident reporting processes and procedures. We know that is a vulnerability throughout industry. A lot of policies say report a cyber incident within 72 hours. That's just not realistic or feasible. So we're relooking our processes. How do we make it easier for our suppliers? And then once we get that information, how do we respond and remediate as quick as possible?
Great. And Mike, I want to get back to CMMC. Obviously, SolarWinds, everything's kind of interrelated, and you can kind of, if nothing else, SolarWinds reiterates the fact that programs like CMMC are worthwhile. But from the CMMC side, Mike, can you talk a little bit about what you've been doing with your subs, current or prospective, to ensure they are prepared to become CMMC certified? I'm sure some of it overlaps with what you just mentioned.
I kind of want to tack on a little bit to the SolarWinds.
You can do that too, absolutely.
Right? Just it's always hard to follow Jeff on these panels because he usually gets it all correct. But from a GDIT point of view, we're completely aligned with L3 Harris on that. But there's something to be said about when a certain cyber event basically cancels Christmas last year, right? I mean, we were all working in the cyber world throughout the holidays on this thing, and I think our first reaction to SolarWinds was, man, this was a risk we had talked about for a long time, and we had kind of just, we're gonna look at it, and we all knew it was there, but to see it realized in such a grand fashion, I think was a really eye-opening moment for everyone, right, in the cyber world. And I think for us, it was, it's an attack on what we took for granted, which was the extension of our trust to third-party software providers that provide off-the-shelf products, right? There's a lot of stuff we were doing to try to figure that out and manage that risk, which we all knew that risk was there, but to see it actually play out was something that we literally have to sit here and say we can't trust off-the-shelf products like we used to, right? We have to consider this particular risk, right? So kind of piggybacking on what Jeff said, it's accelerating your zero trust principles, right? It's working with contracts to figure that out. It's talking to your suppliers and your software vendors about the need for transparency in these things. So Jeff had talked about reporting. You look at the SolarWinds event, as spectacular as it was, I think it was so cool to see the transparency play out both by FireEye and SolarWinds, either by choice or necessity, right? But either way, it was there. And how that leads to growth and maturity in the market and the risk in and of itself, as Ed mentioned, in terms of SolarWinds, saying, hey, you need to be asking everyone this, right? So when we look at that, the continuous monitoring aspect of third-party risk management has really come to play. Jeff mentioned the use of open source intel, contractually holding our vendors to a software bill of materials or how their software is compromised, really getting into the nuts and bolts about how our trusted business partners are doing testing or signing their code is really a seismic shift in the way in which our industry is consuming software. So I just want to foot stomp that for a second, Neal, because in the end, CMMC would not have prevented this thing.
Correct.
It wouldn't have. It would have made the companies perhaps slightly more resilient as it relates to responding to the attack, but it would not have prevented it. And I think that's something that we need to really be clear about, is that CMMC is a hygiene model and a maturity model that probably would not have materially affected, in my opinion, the SolarWinds crisis that we all dealt with.
No, that's a great point. And again, just circling back to CMMC, and I think obviously.
Bill, can I chime in on that last one?
Yeah, sure.
We're going.
We're going to change the title of the presentation.
SolarWinds Aftermath. I think, well, I'll tie it to CMMC to keep us on topic a little bit. I think CMMC is the first of a movement towards the days of self-attestation being over, right? So CMMC came about because DFAR 7012, the recognition after doing some surveys and checking with people was implementation is not that good. It's inconsistent. It's not well understood. Some people are flat out ignoring it. And that evidence, came to bear. And I think, there's been a common theme amongst vendors, cloud providers, software vendors to say, it's secure. My thing that I'm selling in the marketplace is secure. And often that's not really supported by much beyond their own claims. So, the idea of having CMMC or FedRAMP or other kind of official badge as a standard to say, yeah, I'm going to show you that I'm taking cybersecurity seriously by having this badge on my product or my company, whatever the case may be. I think that's CMMC is the start of that becoming the standard of care. So, Mike, you mentioned, asking all your vendors, well, what exactly are you asking them for? Are you going to ask them, are you secure? They're all going to say yes. So
right.
Having something more specific that consumers can ask for, and that is, I'll say, challenging to attain, or at least, a known level of effort to attain, is going to be important. So I think, again, CMMC is the first large-scale formal attempt at that. We've seen it in, High Trust does it for healthcare, for example, but, in a smaller market segment. But, I think going across 300,000 companies, does that spread to the government? Does it spread to other things, to other people, state and local governments, maybe even commercial buyers start to rely on those kind of badges? I think so, and I hope so.
But as Jeff mentioned, right, we can rely on open source intel to give us a perspective. Now, it's not perfect, right? You have products like BitSight out there and things like that. It's not perfect, Ed, but I think it is the responsibility within our supply chain to be looking at that as a data point and having the conversation. For instance, we're doing that now at GDIT, right? And I'm sure L3 Harris is doing it as well, right? When we see certain things that we can deduce from an external standpoint, we have to ask ourselves the question whether this particular software vendor or subcontractor related to CMMC should be in our ecosystem, and what sort of intervention can we put ourselves in place to talk through with them and understand what the real story is, what's going on within their networks. So it's an interesting time to be in cyber and supply chain risk management. It's been fun.
Absolutely. So let me tie that back one more time to CMMC. So where we are in the life cycle of CMMC is you are going to be dependent for at least the time being on still self-assessments to a certain degree. As I mentioned, nobody is certified yet. So again, bringing the question back to Mike and Jeff, even could be folks on the webinar here today that would be interested in being a sub to somebody like an L3 or GDIT. What are you asking of them at this point to see how prepared they are? Because they don't have a certification yet, because nobody does. So what are you guys doing with your subs, either current or prospective, as it relates to CMMC?
I'll go first. So I think kind of what probably most primes are doing, they're focusing on that NIST 800-171 compliance. That's probably our biggest risk, just from a time and implementation standpoint. Ironically, we've kind of gone down a different path. We do interact with our suppliers, but what I've noticed is if you get to that sector, business unit, and segment executive leadership, and you start talking about risk to their supply chain in terms of money and lost business opportunity, that seems to trickle down to buyers, and then they work with their suppliers, and that's where we're getting a lot of engagement. So we're also seeing from our customers, and we're looking to do the same, is they're not asking, hey, what's your CMMC level, but we are starting to get questions about what's our anticipated level, and in a roundabout way asking questions in our reps and certs of, they may not say, hey, are you CMMC level 3, but do you have plans in place to protect CUI data? Mm-hmm. So it's a roundabout way to get that information without asking for it. But we've been working with our suppliers, sending out surveys, asking those similar questions to just try to get a proactive, response from them and get a good picture. One thing that we are promoting, especially to our small businesses that we know are impacted not only by CMMC, but COVID-19 as well. So now there's a business case decision to make. Is those free resources out there? I know Project Spectrum with the DIB and their mentor program. There are some requirements, but it's a good resource. So we're trying to research those opportunities and really focus in on our small business partners.
Yeah, and from a GDIT point of view, same thing that Jeff mentioned, keeping in mind that there is supposed to be a COTS exemption for CMMC. So I think the final rule will probably get more details around what exactly that means. But what it means to me is we have a large subcontractor community, as Jeff does, that is going to have to comply at some point in time. So what we've done is just massive outreach on, at least a scale like this where we're doing panels, but also individually, and at least in the interim, leading with a lot of empathy related to this thing. Right? This is big. It's scary. It could really impact people's businesses that they've worked very, very hard to grow and mature over time. So for us, we've looked at our pipeline. We've looked at some of our subcontractors and our business partners that we've worked with over a long time. And we're literally taking a one-by-one approach of sending letters and offering assistance and a dialogue around what does this mean, right? Because a lot of these small businesses don't even have cyber teams, right? They may have one IT person that kind of does IT and cyber. And when they look at something as daunting as the 110 requirements of NIST 171 or 130 in CMMC level 3, there's a lot of paralysis through analysis going on. So our approach has been to lean in, talk to our critical subcontractors and understand where they are and offer our assistance. We're not going to do it for them. We're not going to provide a solution for them. We're also advocating for kind of our big tech partnerships, maybe, come up and have a turnkey solution, but we have yet to see that. So that's really what we've been focusing on. And to Jeff's point, this to us, not only is it the right thing to do, right, but it is a business resiliency issue, not only for GDIT, but our entire supply chain. The worst thing that could happen here is that someone throws their hands in the air and says, look, this is going to be too much for me. It's going to be too expensive. We're going to exit the market, right? That's not good for our businesses, and that's not good for our country. So that's what we're pursuing. We did it last year, and we have a really robust program this year to continue the reach back. The thing I ask is that when the invite goes out, take it, right? We've been having some people that have been saying, hey, I don't get CUI, it's not going to apply to me. I don't do this, it's not going to apply to me. And I think that's the worst thing to do, because this 4 years is going to go by in a blink of an eye, and we need to be preparing right now.
I agree. And it's interesting. I know Ed and I, we both help organizations prepare for ultimate certification, assessments for certification. And I always think of things, on a spectrum. We've got folks that are, have received external attestations around NIST 800-171. They're documented out the wazoo. They've got a perfect 110 in SPRS. They could hold a number of different certifications. You've got folks in the middle that maybe aren't overly familiar with the NIST standards, but they may hold an ISO cert. They may hold a SOC 2 audit. But you do have the folks on the other end that have never had to comply with anything. And quite frankly, there's no documentation there. There's no, they could be an HVAC company that has blueprints to a base. They could be a painting company that paints ships down in Newport News, that all of a sudden they have CUI, some of which you mentioned they have a small IT department. Some don't have IT departments. Some are outsourced. And quite frankly, the majority of organizations these days have some sort of reliance, sometimes light, but sometimes heavy reliance on third parties. So
and think about that. That's a business. So CMMC level 3, to Ed's point, was an expected outcome as much as 3 or 4 years ago. Regardless of what the self-attestation led us to, CMMC level 3 is considered an indirect business cost. So if that hasn't been built in up to this point in time, that's going to be severely impactful.
Absolutely.
to small businesses and their rates, right? So like we're in the reality that we're in now, and that's a hard one, particularly at the level 3 for small businesses.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, Mike, to your point, there were plenty of folks that we have spoken with over the years that, quite frankly, either threw their hands up or put their head in the sand and just thought it would go away or thought it would never apply to them and so forth. So, Ed, I wanted to stay with third parties really quickly. I know we're getting towards the last quarter here of our time, but as an MSP and a CSP, a cloud service provider, yourself with NeoSystems, can you speak to the impact of CMMC to what the services that you are providing to your clients in an MSP or CSP fashion?
You know, to the point that Mike made about, you know, the worst thing is if some companies sort of throw up their hands and say, I can't do this, right? Our goal as a service provider is to make sure CMMC is achievable by everyone who's in business with the DoD, and you know, as it expands. And the way we do that is by, you know, purpose-built, standardized offerings that are easy to consume. So the idea is to say, for these companies that don't have an IT department, don't have a security department, maybe have no core competency around IT management at all, you know, maybe their core competency is manufacturing, maybe their core competency is, you know, high-end design or innovative biology, right? These are companies that don't have any business reason to be good at IT or cybersecurity, right, to be able to offer that to them in a package that's easy for them to consume. So for us, that's, you know, it's SecOps, right? Security operations. So intersection of security, IT operations, all those things got to be in sync for CMMC. And this is something that it's new for some of these companies, but it's not new for managed service providers, right? So managed service providers that do this at scale for large numbers of clients have needed that maturity for some time just to keep their business running well, to keep it efficient. So while it's new for them and new under CMMC that they have to demonstrate that, you know, MSPs typically already have that maturity and bring it. So I guess, and circling back to your question, Neal, on what's the impact on our services, I would say it's been mostly alignment, right? So, you know, NeoSystems was in the government contractor support business. That's been our focus for 18 years. So not so much shifting to the federal sector, but really just aligning with what's new in CMMC. We do a lot of work on scope, I think, understanding, you know, what systems need to be compliant, what systems don't, helping people segregate where it makes sense. If we've got companies that have a DoD component and a non-DoD component, they might want to manage those things separately. So I think that's, you know, there's been some work there. It's become more important under CMMC to be precise about that, right? Instead of just, you know, here are some services, you can consume them, being very clear that these services are aligned with CMMC, and other ways that you may manage IT in other parts of your business may not be. Is their CMMC new standard. So I think everyone, including us, is all in the direction finding mode. So I mean, we put a lot of work into making sure that we're sort of staying ahead of current interpretation of the requirements. It's a little bit new, especially how they're going to be perceived by an auditor and what it's going to take to get things through audit. So that's been an impact, I think, on our thinking and how we deliver our services, making sure they're audit ready, right?
Yep. Yeah, and audit ready. So just to kind of take a step back from the process. And again, our assumption coming into this webinar here in April was that folks were familiar enough with the model, knew what the reason behind it was. I know we've touched on certain aspects of both already today, but the idea being that companies have either already prepared and are ready to undergo an assessment that need it, or folks are in the process of preparing versus waiting to see if this thing is going to stick, and do I need to spend money on it now? Do I need to invest time, money, and resources into preparing? And one thing I just want to make clear with the folks that are attending today is the amount of time. So Mike talked about, even from a monetary perspective, you know, what is the cost going to be? You have a cost of potential consulting in and around getting ready. You have a potential cost all the way down to hardware and software implementation that may or may not be required based on level of certification you're ultimately looking to achieve. You've got your internal burden on your internal resources, and then you've got ultimately your cost of compliance. That's good for 3 years, but how much that's going to cost. But the other thing is the time. This isn't something that you're going to be able to pick up the phone and call somebody and get somebody out there on Monday and end up with a certification, you know, by the end of the week or the end of the month. This is something that they've talked about for a good amount of time now, that you should be on average expecting about 6 months of preparation time before you are reaching out to a C3PAO for certification. And at that time that you are reaching out, it's assumed that if you are looking at level 3, for example, you should have a perfect 110 score in the SPRS system. You should not have any open POAM items and really, be able to undergo an assessment. From Cherry Record's perspective, I've said all along, folks that have been on our webinars or podcasts, our goal during the readiness process is to beat you up worse than the assessors. We want the assessment to be somewhat of a formality and have everything lined up so that when you engage ultimately with the C3PAO, that they come in and just knock things down and everything is where it's supposed to be and is readily available, and it's not a scramble to try and find a piece of evidence or determine who's best suited to speak to a specific area. So just wanted to reiterate that while we had folks on the call. I know we didn't spend a lot of time on the certification process itself, but just to reiterate the fact that this isn't a, oh yeah, I'm ready to go and get somebody out here tomorrow and we'll blow through this. This is a process that's expected to take between preparing for and then ultimately undergoing an assessment, probably 6 months at the lowest, all the way up to a year. So for folks that are thinking, oh, we won't need this till probably the end of this year, quite frankly, you should already be in flight. Anybody have anything to tack on for that? That was just a little bit of soapbox from folks that we're helping now, but anybody have anything additional to tack on there?
I would say if the assessment, the record assessment is more than a formality, you're probably doing it wrong, right? In other words, the idea is that the assessment is to measure maturity and the institutionalization of security, that these measures have been baked into how you're running your company, how you're running your IT, how you're handling information. If it's not, if it is baked in, passing the assessment is just is an easy outcome. If the assessment is the goal, you're focused more on that than on the maturity, then you're going to have trouble passing those tests, I think.
I'd agree. All right, Jeff, I'm going to start left to right on my screen with a couple kind of closing general questions, and then certainly leave a couple minutes. I have not seen anything come through in the chat, so I'll keep things moving on the actual presentation, and we can leave a few minutes. I'll put up our contact information here and again in a second. You had mentioned Project Spectrum as a good resource, and one of the things is, like a lot of things these days, when you get online, a lot of conflicting information and so forth. So in terms of everything available, which somewhat can be confusing or even conflicting when you're reading about CMMC, a good source of information for you. You mentioned Project Spectrum, correct?
Correct.
Anything else that folks should be looking at, or things that you've found helpful yourself or when providing information to your subs?
Yeah, I try to use the government resources, the free government resources that are available. Obviously, we partner with NeoSystems, and they help us run a portal that provides a lot of informational resources and updated information, and we pass that along to our suppliers. I think you had mentioned earlier, Neal, that a lot of people get their information from LinkedIn, and there's a lot of personal commentary and opinions. Some valid, but you can get yourself in trouble there. So if you go to the government website, if you work with your prime or your customer, and they provide you those resources, I think those are the most helpful because they're the most factual and up to date.
Gotcha. Mike, what would you say the most pressing CMMC related items are that you're focused on in the next 90 days?
Reciprocity, right? It's going to drive a lot of the scope of work, and then after that it's really going to be how to scale, but definitely reciprocity.
Great. Ed, anything different from your side?
On next 90 days, most of our work right now is, I'll call it deferred maintenance. So it's getting folks get their SPRS score up, to put it frankly, right? So the SPRS score is measuring NIST 800-171 compliance. So this is how you've done in meeting those requirements that were already there before CMMC came to being. I think I don't know if that technically meets the definition of CMMC related items, but yeah, I would say that's the majority of focus, is making sure that those things are squared away, and then beyond that, we look more at the maturity items that are needed for passing CMMC audit.
Sure.
And Neal, Ed's not going to plug this, but I'll plug it for him. And he didn't put me up to this, I promise. But the NeoSystems Town Hall series has been very, very beneficial for me personally. I'm with Jeff. I go to the True Source #1. #2, I go to the ISACs and the ISAC and things like that. They have unbelievable resources. And #3, I found the Town Hall series to be exceptional in terms of bringing different voices and perspectives. It's actually been a sounding board for me to, like, am I thinking about this wrong? Am I doing this kind of consistent with everyone else? So again, I'm plugging for you, Ed. I know you didn't put me up to it, but it's been very, very helpful.
Yeah, I could certainly echo that as
thank you both.
Being a past attendee like you have been, Mike, and it was a great experience for me. And the other thing is that they're very easy to consume. Ed, I believe, are they every Wednesday? Am I getting the date right?
Every Wednesday, 1 o'clock, 30 minutes. Although I've been known to make it more like 38 minutes from time to time. So.
Yeah, it's good interaction, good open conversations, no set agenda. You can submit questions ahead of time during, and that has been a great series. And kudos to Elizabeth Menez who helps coordinate that on the NeoSystem side. That's been a great series throughout for a good amount of time.
Well, and all three of you gentlemen have joined as a guest on that, and as Mike mentioned, the goal there is to have sort of diverse perspectives. So, and that's my objective is I want to learn from it, and I hope the audience learns as much as I do in talking to all these smart people on the topic. So,
agreed.
So, thanks for the plug, Mike. Much appreciated.
Yeah, and I'll say the same thing for this panel, and thank you to you guys. We're going to wrap up here, but we did want to have representation, as you can see, not only from industry with Mike and Jeff, but even from the MSP and third-party provider side, and Ed, and then myself from the assessment side. We did want to keep this only to an hour, and we could have focused on any one area and spoken for an hour, and certainly SolarWinds could probably go for longer than that. But we do appreciate everyone attending today. And quite frankly, as we mentioned several times, we are all open that if somebody wants to reach out with questions, comments, as Mike mentioned, consider him a resource to use for the IAC. And it looks like there's some questions coming into the chat, so I'm going to take my screen off here. But by all means, thank you again to the ACG and the panelists for attending today. We're going to take this off the screen and then get onto the chat, and then hand it back to Nicole here in just a second.
Yeah, I took a shot at that around adjudication. What is this dispute process if a company does not comply with CMMC requirements? Unless my panelists have heard differently, I have not heard any additional details on like a formal adjudication process.
So I'll address that in like many things with CMMC. I'm going to have an asterisk or a caveat behind it. When I went through our training, there was actually a section on dispute and resolution. And quite frankly, it was something that, along with reciprocity and some other key areas, we thought would be pertinent to address today. The reason why we didn't overly address it in today is because, like many other things, it is appearing to change. I will tell you that what it was originally was as trained, 6 months ago now, was that there would be an allotment for items to be remediated within a 90-day period. The decision for those, whether or not things could be remediated, would lie with your assessment firm, with the C3 PAO, and you'd have 90 days. Then the C3PO at that point would act as a middleman, much like the way HITRUST is configured, to where we would in turn prepare a package, submit it up to the AB for their review and QA with a recommendation for certification or not. And if they agreed with our recommendation, they would either issue a certification or wouldn't. And if there was a disagreement on the government contractor side as to whether or not they did not achieve certification, for example, they could issue dispute, which at the time it had to be done within a certain period after completion, and it would then go to the AB. They would perform a formal review and decide whether or not they agreed with the original decision by the C3PAO, or in fact, if they needed to perform their own review, wherein they would come back to the government contractor with their own folks and perform their own review, and so forth. And that cost would be on the government contractor. I think it's important to note. The reason why we didn't present on that today is because there's some thought that the AB, as a result of them achieving their own ISO certification, will get out of that line of business, much like the issuing of certification itself. It used to be that the thought was the C3POs would sit in the middle, we'd conduct the work, prepare a package, go up to the AB would issue the certification. They're now no longer doing that. So to Mike's point, they have not released details around the adjudication process publicly. It was trained on some of the provisional assessors months ago, but they've gotten away from that. So even something like that, once you see the rule go final, there are areas such as reciprocity and dispute and resolution that I think they need to really get a handle on, as well as obviously who is going to be ultimately issuing the certifications, because as of now, it looks as though it may come directly from the C3PAOs. Not seeing any other questions in the chat. Hopefully I left up our contact information long enough, but you certainly can ping us on LinkedIn or reach out to Nicole from ACG, who has all of our contact information as well if there's any follow-up that's needed. But Nicole, if I could, thank you one more time and just hand it back to you, and thank you again to all the panelists today.
Thanks,
Yes,
Neal.
thank you.
Thank you.